everyone. Welcome to the IntraCultural podcast. I'm Lucy.
And I'm Missy. We're two anthropologists that co founded a DEIB firm, Willing Observers.
The IntraCultural podcast covers a range of topics and answers common questions that can better be understood using the concept of culture. So, before we get started, we're going to do a little clip about our ICS program. We do a certificate and a certification. So if you're interested in learning more and become more proficient in DEIB, whether that's to help you in your career development or in your current profession, it's a really updated course where we're talking about and applying all the changes of DEI landscape into the program. And essentially, the goal is that by the end, you'll get a certificate or a certification so you can learn how to create more inclusive cultures in your department, organization, university, you name it. And the main difference between the two programs is that one of them is gives you the foundations and the concepts, and the other one we help you develop your own strategic plan. And there's additional more resources in a toolkit that comes with that. Okay, so how are you doing, Missy? Did you really like our marketing segment about where we sponsor ourselves?
I like that our sponsor for our show is us. And so that's I feel like that's really innovative.
It is. So you'll probably hear that eventually. You can do what most people do and just click next, next, next on your podcast and you just skip it.
Don't tell them that. That's horrible marketing. Our sponsors are going to be really mad.
Yeah, we're going to be so bad. So, other than that, how are you doing, Missy?
It's a busy time. It's a busy week. It's I'm ready for a nap. I'll tell you one thing that I attempted this week, which was the most California thing ever, is I tried to do a juice cleanse.
Oh, how many days did you do it?
I did it for 2 days and then I got hungry.
I would have been hungry like 4 hours into it. That's really impressive.
I was like it's supposed to be like, to detox you. I think I want to try it again when I'm not so busy because you're supposed to just kind of like chill while you do it. And instead I was trying to like write papers and I was like, this probably isn't how you're supposed to do a juice cleanse. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe when you're on vacation or something and you don't have to move, you can just lay there and not spend any calories. That's how I would do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was my excitement. Very exciting. I'm trying to go full like stereotypical Southern California. So I've got like, kombucha and yoga. And I was like, you really just need to do a juice cleanse to go all in.
I feel like we are both typical Californian people because I ran out of my matcha powder today and I was so sad. So I was hunting through the cabinets and I found this Ceylon tea that my mom got from Syria probably 2 years ago. I got so excited, but I haven't had black tea in forever. So now my heart is beating very fast.
Yeah, no,
I'm
that's
doing
what
hard drugs now. That's what I'm doing.
see. Well, that's 2 days off of caffeine too as part of the juice cleanse. Like it's like no caffeine, no refined sugar, like no gluten, like so I have 1 cup of tea and I'm like,
Yeah. Okay, so we're on the same page today.
yeah, this
I
is
don't think I can finish this. I think it's like halfway done. I'm
it's
gonna put it away.
really, really exciting podcast. Well,
Uh,
I mean, this lends itself to the topic, the jittery. Today we're going to talk about what's going on with the attack on higher education around DEI, and we're going to focus on that in part by thinking about how Trump is interpreting discrimination. So I'm sure that, although I shouldn't be sure that everyone is aware that the administration is pulling federal funding from universities if
mhm,
they don't adhere to his definition of discrimination. So
mhm.
we're really into series right now. So we're going to do one today on how Trump interprets discrimination and DEI. And then we're going to do a second one probably in the next week or two that's about how Trump interprets Title IX and sex and gender and how that leads to the pulling of federal funding. But today it is jittery, all about discrimination.
I really like how we can come up with these themes on the fly. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot, Missy, about what you said a long time ago when I think January or February, which is we knew when Trump was elected that we were going to be busy, but we had no idea that he was going to make DEI the center of all his attacks. That is wild.
It is wild. I keep trying to explain this to people who like walk up to me with sad face and they're like, "Is your job okay?" And I'm like, "Oh, you've no idea how busy I am." Um,
It is, yeah, it is. We've been like under a fire hose. So, yeah, so we're going to talk today about how what's going on with the higher attacks. We could call them that, I guess,
I feel like that is an appropriate slip of the tongue right there.
on the against DEI and how different institutions have responded. And we're going to talk about um, how those executive orders, we had one right after his inauguration on January 21st, and then we just had a really recent one a few days ago from when we're recording this podcast on April 25th, I believe, which extends a lot of the impacts on DEI, the negative impacts on DEI, and it continues to push a certain definition of discrimination that goes counter to what we know discrimination to be. So we're gonna unpack those concepts and those understandings over the next 40 minutes or so.
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like that's a good segue to dive in. So, how are these executive orders attempting to redefine discrimination? What is discrimination? How are they challenging understandings and looking to kind of dismantle policy, create new policy under all this kind of like problematic definitions? The January 21st EO, I know we talked a little bit about it in a podcast episode at the time, but I think a good place to really focus on how that itself gets articulated is looking at the letter that was sent out by the Department of Education to educational institutions around it was very nice. They sent it on Valentine's Day, is that right?
Yeah, and it's called the Dear Colleague letter. So if you're not familiar with these, that's what they call the letters that president sends to higher education institutions. And Obama sent one in his presidency. Biden sent one, and they're just basically relaunching the new expectations that president might have of higher ed. So that's what the Dear Colleague letters are supposed to do.
Yeah. So the February 14th letter was a doozy. And it really kind of, articulated things that we were speculating about after the January 21st executive order about how he was thinking about and defining discrimination. And one of the big things that you see in that letter, and we'll link it in the show notes so you can see the letter itself. But one of the big takeaways from that letter um, is looking at discrimination and redefining discrimination under the kind of umbrella of what we would call, reverse discrimination,
Mhm.
which is a kind of inversion that a lot of different lawsuits have tried to push back against these civil rights laws over the years by claiming that really the problem the problem in higher ed and other places is that if we're thinking about race is that everything should be equal, and so if that white people can be discriminated against in the exact same way and to the exact same degree and for the exact same reasons that people of color can be. And so that's let's take a go at unpacking this. Like, what is this idea of reverse discrimination? How does it kind of overlap with how we think about equality and equity?
Mhm. And one of the things that is really problematic about this idea of reverse discrimination or even reverse racism is that you can equate both, right? That you can equate histories and legacies of systematic exclusion, segregation in the United States with more so the efforts meant to rectify those legacies and those histories, which might, to be fair, in all fairness, might create some kinds of exclusion, but it is not on the same playing field. It is not the same thing, right? And so, can I read a quote from one of them
Yeah.
from the letter? So this is one of the things that just was kind of shocking and shows how little understanding the administration has of how systems of discrimination work. But they say these institutions embrace of pervasive and repugnant race-based preferences and other forms of racial discrimination have emanated throughout every facet of academia. Note racial discrimination, they mean against white people. In
Mhm.
a shameful echo of a darker period in this country's history, many American schools and universities even encourage segregation by race at graduation ceremonies and in dormitories and other facilities. Now, here the talking. So when I was in undergrad, we had a separate ceremony. So I got two bachelors, integrated biology, anthropology, and I went to three ceremonies, one for those two. And then the third one was for Raza ceremony, which is where all the Latinos, like Hispanic students, we had our own different ceremony and we got to invite our family and our friends. And those were bilingual. And so he's saying that because students are organizing with faculty and administrator these kinds of other events that are supposed to create more belonging and more community, those by themselves are discriminatory because they are don't allow white people to register for those events. I'm
Right.
guessing. Even
I
though race is very complicated and my sisters could pass as white and they have gone to those events. And my ex at the time was white and he was at the event. He didn't walk on the stage, but
But they're not for, right?
correct.
I think this idea that not just, I mean, and it's even that it's not even that like somehow white people are being kept out, right? It's that these aren't designed for, right, like for white people that are like monolingual, that like their cultural background and their history is like, I don't know, my like great ancestor came from, like, I don't know, wherever in Europe on the Mayflower. Right? Like it's
Mhm.
it's not designed for that. Right? And that if you have anything that is designed for anyone who is not that person, that somehow it is discriminatory.
And and even more so, they say that that really hurts you, Missy, because quote, such programs stigmatize students who belong to particular racial groups based on crude racial stereotypes. Consequently, they deny students the ability to participate fully in the life of a school.
The life of a school that was designed for me as a white person.
Yeah, now you can't go to these ceremonies. How does that make you feel?
But remember, I can go to those ceremonies. I just can't walk across the stage.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and but how do I feel? I feel so excluded since everything else there is made for me.
Literally everything.
Literally everything else is made for me, but except for this one thing, and therefore I'm excluded. And that is the point, right? That's the point of why, you know, why all of these anti-discrimination laws exist is because all of these structures and systems have historically been made for white people and for the white people in power, right? And this is more complicated, of course, in terms of, class and other aspects of identity. But this, for the people in power, the systems are made for them. And therefore, you have to rectify all the many hurdles that someone who is not already a member of that group have to jump over in order to access the systems that we find to be normal, right? Or just the way things are.
Mhm.
And it's egregious to see that we're kind of flipping that on its head, in a way that just does not respect anything about the Civil Rights Act or the history of civil rights law at all.
Yeah. And just as an example, like let's say for the ceremony, like my mom understands English just fine. But many parents there that don't know English, whose kids graduated from, I went to UC Berkeley, from UC Berkeley, the number one public school in the university. They don't know English. They raised really educated, smart kids who worked really hard to graduate from the top university, and now they're attending the ceremonies where they don't understand what's going on. That is what that extra ceremony for Latino and Hispanic students was supposed to do, is show the parents how proud they are by allowing them to participate fully.
Mhm.
So in effect, by saying you don't include those parents, you're doing it in order to include the students that benefit from every other ceremony.
Yep.
So that is what's problematic about assuming that discrimination works equally across race. It doesn't, right? There are legacies and histories and systems that discriminate against certain kinds of groups by excluding them, by segregating them, by offering them less opportunities. And then there's the kinds of interpersonal discriminations that might make people feel excluded in that instance or in that moment, but it's not embedded in how the system works. And that's
Yep.
a really important point.
It is a really important point, and you know, if we look at, like, even embed this in the history of, like, reverse discrimination cases and how they have been litigated throughout, right? The kind of, the legal history of this. This is outside the university, but one example that comes to mind right away is in a case where, in the kind of late 70s, where you have, right, you have a union and they're trying to train people that so that they can internally within the organization move up, but they're recognizing that they have fewer black workers and they have fewer black, workers that are in positions of leadership. And so while the union has seniority rules, and right, that has to be the people that are at the top of that seniority that get access to the training first, that, maybe some of our black workers need to, right, jump the line and be embedded in that kind of queue so that they can get training, because we need to have a pipeline to get people right into those positions. So in that case, the white dude sued, right? Because, a black worker who also had union seniority, right, as a black worker, quote unquote, jumped the line. And in that case, the justices, right, this was still when we were kind of negotiating what was happening with reverse racism and like affirmative action and, all of these cases. And the justices were very clear. They were like, this case, right, if we don't recognize the intention of the Civil Rights Act, if we do not understand the intention of all of these laws to create, right, you're looking to create equality, right? Equality is not the standard at the beginning. You have to do different things, equity, right, for different people in order to create equality. And that is the intention of the Civil Rights Act, not that everybody gets treated equally from the jump, but that they aren't. And so you have to do things differently so that we get to the baseline of equality.
Mhm.
And I think that is something that gets lost into all this litigation and all this talk. It's like people aren't equal from the beginning. That's the point, right? You're getting them to that place. And that's how there's this mismatch in understanding equity and equality and where equality is supposed to come into play in this kind of civil rights law.
Absolutely. And I just want to emphasize how bad this moment is, because the Trump administration is not only redefining what is discrimination on policy, but they're also using federal funds and taking them from those that don't comply with this new definition, including research grant that has been given to faculty, to grad students, to postdocs to study the effects of these kinds of systemic inequities and systemic and racial discrimination.
Yeah.
And one of the institutions that's really suffering right now is literally the health industry with, and there's so many more, but we know, for example, like literally the National Cancer Institute has, in the National Institute of Health, they have definitions of what is structural racism and systemic racism because it shows up in your health. So, for a really common example is like diabetes, right? Diabetes shows up mostly in Black and Hispanic groups in the United States. That's not because there's a genetic predisposition that Black and Hispanics have to get diabetes, although there's been a lot of research done on that, but it's because people live in poor neighborhoods. And that's a history with redlining practices, right? That not being able to buy homes until the 1970s, 1980s, discrimination in lending practices. So even though there hasn't been legal segregation for a long time, the effects of these policies have led to Black and Hispanics living in poor areas, and not to mention white flight, right? When those people try to move into neighborhoods with a lot of white people just leave and they take their economic wealth out of those neighborhoods. And so all of these, the way that discrimination works is systemic and it shows up in health outcomes. So now, because you live in a poor neighborhood, you have less groceries, you survive mostly on food that is processed. And now you are in that racial demographic and you're more likely predisposition to have diabetes.
Yeah.
So the National Cancer Institute defines structural racism, and this is what they say. Structural racism come from deep patterns of social, economic, and cultural differences that have developed over time between different groups of people. And that's a system of organization and institutional policies that created over time, and they support a continued unfair advantage for some people and an unfair or harmful treatment of others based on their race or ethnic group. So, this is common knowledge among the expert community that studies discrimination and that studies racial and ethnic groups. And also, gender discrimination, discrimination based on sexual orientation. So there is systemic discrimination embedded in our society. But when we talk about structural racism, we're talking about the kinds of inequalities that have developed that create differences in racial and ethnic groups in the United States. So
Yes.
this
And
is bad.
so can we talk about how it now sucks more?
Oh, yeah, yeah. So we just gave you the bottom level of this is bad. Now is it sucks even more.
Oh, don't worry. Don't worry. As of, I don't know if it was April, we'll correct this, April 23rd or April 25th. But there was another executive order recently that is looking to extend the suck into um, the kind of next level. So this is an executive order that I won't even read the name because the name of it is ridiculous. We'll just link it in in the show notes. But this one basically now is saying that not only, right, can you not think about discrimination in the way that the Civil Rights Act intended, right,
Mhm,
as structural, right, and problematic and based on like histories of marginalization, but you also can't think about discrimination as discriminatory effects of programs that were created, even when those programs don't intend to discriminate. So you create a program, the program doesn't intend to discriminate, but it ends up being really discriminatory. That's not discrimination anymore, according to the most recent executive order. And that one is targeting the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, among others. Um, so that one was originally passed to limit discrimination in applications for credit, like small businesses and other kinds of credit applications that, because of histories of risk assessment, didn't intend to discriminate, but because risk is assessed in a way that itself is potentially discriminatory because of those histories of economic marginalization, there was discrimination in credit, right? And credit applications and being able to get credit for different kinds of things. And so the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed to limit discrimination. This executive order tries to say that kind of act is problematic.
And I actually looked into the Wikipedia article of that Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And one of the reasons it was advocated for by Margaret Heckler, the first and only elected woman in the 90th Congress. I don't know if she was the only woman or the first woman in Congress generally, but she was in the 90th Congress. She advocated it because she had so much experience with not being able to get even a credit card on her name or not being able to apply to credit because women were not given credit until after this act was put in place. To
Mhm.
your point, it's not that people intended to discriminate against women by not giving them credit, is that they historically never had it. So they were seen as more risky people. And I'll give you another example of that in 2008, our economic crisis with subprime lending. So at the time, long story short, there's tons of documentaries on this if you're not aware of the subprime lending crisis. A lot of people gave credit and loans to people who could not afford them at very low interest rates that would then become through like those arm interest rates, or they would have low interest rates a few years first, and then they would have higher interest rates down the line 5 years, 7 years later. Those were really popular in 2008, and they allowed a lot of people from marginalized communities to buy a home. People were not asking for proof of that you could pay that loan in 3 to 5 years. They could pay them now, but not later. And I know based on my family, people that were victimized by these kind of predatory loans because these lenders were just targeting anybody that could apply and could qualify for these loans on the first year, knowing that they might not be able to pay it on the third year or the fifth year. So tons of people lost their houses. Who were mostly effective? People of color in this country, right? And really low income people. These were discriminatory, even though people did not intend. They did not go in there and were like, oh, let me find a person of color and give them this loan. Right? That's not how those worked. Is they saw who would qualify. Great. That person qualifies based on their current income. But we see based on the analysis that that had a disparate, unequal, proportionally discriminatory effect on people of color and low income people. So that's what this executive order aims to get rid of, accountability for those kinds of practices.
Yep. And to bring it out of the financial sector and kind of back into like how we can think about this in higher ed, that kind of logic is also present in some of the other kinds of strands of, litigation around reasons that you can discriminate, right?
Mhm.
So legitimate forms of discrimination, because discrimination, like, is something that we have to think about as a negotiation, right? And so in some of the religious liberty cases, right? So cases where people make a claim that their religious freedoms are being, trod upon. There are a couple that are about misgendering, right? So you have like a teacher that misgenders their student in a classroom, and currently, the trend in those cases is that those folks that are misgendering their students are winning their cases because they are claiming that it is their kind of their religious belief that there are only two sexes or two genders. And so they adhere to that belief. So in that case, in many of those cases, the people that are doing the misgendering are not, right, are not necessarily intentionally, like, trying to break existing civil rights law or even disparage some of the people that they are, incidentally targeting, right? But the impact of their adherence to their religious beliefs in that case, or their religious expression, does discriminate against, in this case, often transgender students.
Mhm.
And in a lot of those cases, the 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 teachers in question are using names, right, but won't use pronouns because that somehow, right, it acknowledges that there are more than two genders, and or it is not fixed at birth. So that's how you take that kind of logic of, like, I'm not intending to discriminate, I'm just adhering to this, to my position. But if it does discriminate, then that can be problematic. And we're just getting rid of that. Of
Yeah, but Trump is like, but it's not our fault. We're being equal now. We're treating each other as equals."
equality. Let's
Yay.
all be jerks to each other. Equality.
I like how you like, if you are not watching, Missy toasted with her mug.
That's equality, all right.
So how is higher ed responding? Oh my God. Are we allowed to cuss on this podcast? I don't remember. I was about to do it. I
I
stopped.
think,
Oh
yeah,
my gosh. What a cluster F. That's what I meant to say.
um, a a poop party.
What a poop party. I like that actually. I'm gonna use that. Um, all right. So I think higher ed has been responding in a lot of different ways. If you haven't been up to date, the Princeton president did a really good interview on the Daily. So, plug for them so you can listen to that. And it looks like a lot of these Ivy Leagues have been in cahoots, trying to map out their response, which is great. And they've been responding in a whole different number of ways. Like on one extreme, for example, Columbia capitulated to a lot of Harvard demands. Oh, we should say after the Dear Colleague letter was sent out, then the Trump administration sent individual letters to different universities with a list of demands of what they should be doing.
Mhm.
So Columbia capitulated to their list of demands, which, to be fair, they were not as bad of demands, quote unquote, as Harvard got. Harvard got a really intense list of demands, and so they sued, is their response. I mean, all the list of demands are bad, but in the extreme level of the spectrum, Columbia was like, all right, we'll abide by them. They seem bad, but not as bad. And Harvard was like, these are horrible. No. And then they sued. Do you like my reenactment?
Yes, that's I can imagine, like, a little Harvard with a hat being like, "No," right?
Yeah. But then they just went and surprised us, and as of 16 hours ago, changed the office of DEI to the office of some community or some other sense, like completely.
Office of Campus and Community Life. Yeah.
Thank you. Like, what are you doing, Harvard? I thought you were going all gung ho against Trump. I guess not. Okay, well, I guess we'll tell you what that is.
Yeah. So all of this discrimination stuff, right? Higher ed is impacted in a number of ways, and that's what they've been responding to. And so they're getting, as we mentioned, funding cuts. In some cases, department closures. They have, right, this whole list of demands about eliminating DEI programs themselves, eliminating DEI positions. So, different, as Lucy mentioned, universities are responding in different ways. You know that we are all very sad about the University of Michigan, which had a robust DEI kind of program and resources. They had this robust set of resources.
Yeah.
I used to send people there all the time because they had such great resources for training, for education, and they went they they
Yeah.
capitulated.
The University of Michigan was seen as the flagship school for DEI strategic planning. I first actually learned of their strategic planning maybe 5 years ago at a DEI conference of some sort. I don't remember where exactly, but only them, University of Michigan, and Tulane University at the time were the only schools that I could find that had developed robust strategic plans. I could be wrong, but then now, now the University of California has them. Many different universities do, but they were really seen as a flagship because at the time when I saw that presentation, they were already on their second on diversity strategic planning 2.0, while everyone else was still trying to figure out how do you do a DEI strategic plan.
Yep.
And they were so generous with their resources. As Missy mentioned, their website, it was super robust. Here's our strategic plan. Here are our goals. Not only that, they had implemented it across the entire university in different units and different factions. I think the last number I saw was that at least there were at least 1,100 people at University of Michigan that were doing DEI work in one way or another, or 1,000 people, because they
Mhm.
were embedding DEI into the goals of departments, of different units, as I mentioned, and they were truly trying to create system-wide org change.
Yep.
And then one day, I'm on the Amtrak going from San Diego to LA, and I'm just having a nice old time. And then I see a headline: University of Michigan dismantles all of that.
Mhm. Just, I mean, bonkers, right? Like it's and this is one of the responses, right? Is that like some universities will fear, right? Because this is, meant to create fear that they will completely dismantle, right? Because they're afraid of the lawsuits. They can't afford to lose all of that funding, which I would argue that there are ways to get around some of that, right? But that's one, avenue when you're under attack is to just fold or to fold preemptively, which a number of universities are doing because they fear the cost of litigation, even as well as the cost of defunding. And we'll talk about that a little more about how strategic litigation has been used to defund universities around Title IX when we talk about Title IX attacks as well. Right? But it's a strategy, and the universities are under pressure for money. And so see this as the major funding stream and jettison, right?
Yeah.
Every
And looking into University of Michigan, it seems like their main pressure with their regents,
yeah.
that it was their regents that put a lot of pressure on them. So this happened right after around the time that the first executive order was signed. So it was definitely very shocking for people in the DEI space. But
Mhm.
to be honest, I'm still very surprised about Harvard's move recently. So Missy mentioned earlier some of the demands, but I wanted to add a couple other demands that the Trump administration placed on them, which was basically government oversight of their admissions policies,
Yeah.
and that they would require Harvard to report people who are international students that were seen basically as violating some kind of conduct, vague, ambiguous term, the conduct of the university. And here, code in there is targeting student protests,
Yeah.
right? And targeting people from right now, the pro Palestine and the Israel Gaza protests that have been going on for years now. And they wanted Harvard to put more limits on freedom of speech expressions and to increase the penalties on students who were seen to violate the freedom of speech um, policies.
Yeah. Which is a whole nother thing, right? That a number of universities have already responded to that, including the California State University system, which we could do a whole episode on that, but we will not. But that is, yeah,
Mhm.
that's part of these demands. And so in addition to folding, right, what are our other kinds of responses and response options? One is rebranding. right? And that's what Harvard seemed like they were going to the mattresses and they were gonna like fight full on. But then 15 hours from when this podcast is being recorded, they rebranded their DEI office to the Office of Campus and Community Life. And so you see that, right? And rebranding is its own strategy and thinking about how to do this work and to do this work without necessarily like the ire, right, of
Yeah.
administration or the state coming down upon you. It's just strange that this is the tactic that they're taking in this moment, given the fact that they seem to double down on DEI so publicly.
Yeah, I it really makes me question what is what is their angle here? Because I know a lot of these universities, and there was also another letter that was signed by over 100, institutions of higher education, where they're just signing it in protest of government interference in their processes and their policies. And that in itself, establishing the right to academic freedom and independence from the government, those seem to be two main legal avenues that these universities are taking. But in also renaming, it makes me wonder where are you going with this logic, in the sense that maybe they're admitting that there's misunderstandings or misinformations around DEI. And so by rebranding, it's like a good faith effort to show viewpoint diversity. I'm not entirely sure, because in rebranding, many, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but in rebranding, people have generally kept their positions, but their titles might change. Even if they're doing certain kinds of work, they might emphasize other kinds of work. So it's a way to preserve doing the DEI initiatives and programming just under a different name.
Right. Well, it could also be one thing that we talk about a bit is it depends on where their funding streams are coming from in addition to the government, because rebranding can also be used strategically if, that would be a whole nother episode talking about the funding of public and private universities in the United States. But a lot of them have endowments and like specific areas or programs are funded by donors, right? And external I know money, external sources. So, part of in some organizations, part of the logic of rebranding is also for thinking about um, donor money, right?
Yeah.
And where donations are coming from. So, because it's new, we don't quite know what Harvard's logic was, but those are reasons why you see some entities rebranding.
That's a really good point. And I don't think we'll see Harvard admit, oh, we rebranded because we want money. Like,
Right.
but that's a really
No.
good point, because some of our clients are doing that in order to keep their clients.
Mhm.
So yeah, rebrand. I mean, all of it, and what it does show is that there's multi-pronged approaches to really advocating for and defending DEI. And one of the points we made in earlier episodes is, just because people have rebranded or stopped using DEI, it doesn't mean that they have completely abandoned DEI. Now, that's not what happened at University of Michigan. They really closed their offices, and then they, laid people off, and it's really tragic. They will mourn you half-mast flag, University of Michigan. But I do see and I, Missy and I are really hopeful and really optimistic amidst all this mess and this chaos, that we do see coalitions being created in order to really push back. And the lawsuits, last time I checked, the Trump administration, the anti DEI executive orders were being sued by over 2,000 people, or 2 dozen groups. So, and these are lawsuits against these orders for being unconstitutional, for being straight up illegal, for going against equal employment opportunity legislation. So there is work being done to really put injunctions on them, or to try to get them just thrown out.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the strongest legal claim that especially universities have, but it's also been successful in private entities, is the First Amendment claims that they're making, not just at an individual level or for individual like people right on campus, but that the entity itself has like right a certain amount of First Amendment freedoms in addition to right that the people within have to be able to have academic freedom in order for a university to function. But I think a strong area is to say this entity, right, this organization also has First Amendment rights that the government can't encroach upon, because this is the exact definition of what the First Amendment was created for, is the government coming in and telling you exactly what you can do and what you can't do, especially in terms of the content of your viewpoint, right? And if your viewpoint is that DEI is good and you want to have DEI programs in the university and you're not breaking any other laws, which you are
Mhm.
not, and the government comes in and says you can't say that, that's the whole reason that this whole shtick exists, right? Is so that the government can't come in and do that. And I know it's more complicated than that, right? I'm simplifying it incredibly, but I think that that provides potential cover in terms of that area of legal strategy. I hope that, in addition to universities building coalition with each other and building coalitions with private entities for donations, for thinking about funding streams, I hope that they can think about, right, this kind of legal strategy is something that might be successful, if slow, right, but successful.
Yeah. And Missy and I are going to be talking, if you're listening to this podcast before May 9th, we're going to be talking about the impact of these executive orders and fundraising for higher ed. And, I just want to like really underscore what you're saying, Missy, is that there's so many, well, one, like to reiterate, the academic freedom argument is a really strong one. But I think in addition, not but, in addition to that, there's so many people in higher ed who had not thought of themselves as activists or had not thought of themselves as really having political stances against the government. And I think a lot of people now are seeing themselves in these positions because their research is under attack. Their what they can teach in the classroom is under attack. We really, we have heard from academics who are just worried about even teaching a course on race or teaching a course on gender, but for fear of being seen as discriminatory. So to those people, we highly, highly, highly encourage you to put on your activist hat and think, how can I ally myself with other people going through the same issues to create strategies and responses to these executive orders? And as we mentioned earlier, so many institutions are doing different things, but that shows you that institutions have a lot of flexibility in how to respond. That means that some institutions are just going to, cede to those demands, and some institutions are going to push back. And those institutions are made out of people like you who work in them, who have relationships with colleagues in those institutions, and you do also have a voice in the stances that your institution can take. So even though you might be going up against regents or you might be going against really powerful people in this institution, don't think that you're powerless
Yeah.
and just have to wait for what the response is.
Yep. And remember that you also have, potentially local and state laws that can give you some cover. So, keep that in mind as well, because there are multiple avenues that you and your own coalitions can use to advance.
Mhm. Absolutely. So I think we're over time because Missy and I had meetings that started 10 minutes ago. So we have to wrap up.
You do. But I hope that this was useful for everyone. And, please send us an email. Let us know if there's some specific topic around this that you want to hear more about. I can talk about, all the kind of complexities of the First Amendment all day if you want me to talk about that. Most people don't, but happy to do so. And we hope that, you hang in there. It's a tough time.
Yeah. And reach out if you have any questions or we can support in any way. We're really open to having these conversations offline.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Until next time.